Dom is a senior lecturer in our department. He's also one of our admissions tutors, and he teaches modules in social linguistics and phonetics, including language and identity and forensic linguistics. And I think he's now ready to present on accent bias in Britain. Thanks, Dom.
Thanks, Sam, and hello, everyone. I'm going to talk for the last of these sessions about language attitudes. And if you've had a chance to look at some of the materials on the website, you may have come across remarks of this kind. This is one that was taken from an essay written by a former student in linguistics. Have a look at that. It's not untypical of the sorts of things that we hear day to day. These views are very commonly expressed. They're absolutely, unremarkable, at least in the British context. So this person's saying RP is more suitable for certain sorts of occupations than others. This person thinks that brain surgeons shouldn't be speaking with a Geordie accent. That seems to be the thrust of this. So I'm sure we've all been exposed to this kind of thing a lot in the past. And, there's a lot of people out there who think that this kind of remark is perfectly okay, is perfectly legitimate. Being tied up as it is with ideas of rightness and wrongness in language, and quality, good and bad quality, and so forth. And also one thing that keeps coming through in discussions on this topic is the idea that speakers can change their accents if they want to, much as we would change our clothes or our hairstyle, that kind of thing. And given those notions that are out there floating around, we think that there's a real risk of the sorts of biases that we can observe out there in the world turning into actual discrimination. It's where those biases are actually enacted, and potentially in the workplace that could lead to all sorts of unfairness. There's not much research on this, and in fact this is why this is what inspired our project that I'm going to talk about in the remainder of this session. Also in the pre-workshop talk, I go into this material in a bit more detail, and then there's some of this material is also in there. So the project in question is called Accent Bias Britain, ABB, and we teamed up with some colleagues at Queen Mary University of London on that project. Okay, now, so what did we do? We recorded actors speaking aloud some good versus bad answers. What do I mean by that? We actually had these drafted by professional lawyers who were not academic lawyers. They were actually involved in the recruitment process in their own organizations, so they were worded in a very authentic way. And when I say good and bad, I don't mean that there were actually any bad answers. There were good ones and there were sort of extra good ones. We wanted to keep the level of realism high by coming up with answers that could plausibly have been given by an interview candidate in a commercial law firm. So the idea was that these people were interviewing for a position as a trainee solicitor in a big law firm, and these were selected on grounds of realism. I've got some example recordings which I'll play you just some short snippets of.
Brexit may not have a major effect on British law firms, though of course it's too soon to tell what the effects will be. Some Europeans will move back to their home country.
Okay, so that's one example of one of the accents that we chose. Here's another.
Brexit may not have a major effect on British law firms, though of course it's too soon to tell what the effects will be.
Okay, and so on. And so we had a fair few of these. As I'll show you on the next slide, we had some 5 different accents of English. We made sure that the wording was consistent from each script to another. So the idea was that all we were varying was the speaker's accent, not the wording that they used. So it's a form of matched guise design. If you want to go onto the ABB website, you'll find out a lot more detail about this. So those are the 5 accents we tested, and we had 2 speakers of each, 2 male speakers of each. We wanted to ensure that when people gave responses, they were responding to the accent rather than the specific speaker. So we thought we'd better have a couple of speakers of each. There they are. We have RP, received pronunciation, Estuary English, MLE, Multicultural London English, General Northern English, and so-called Urban West Yorkshire English, so that's from Leeds. So by choosing these 5 accents, we could look at multiple dimensions simultaneously. We had the standard, non-standard dimension. we had region, north versus south of England, and we had ethnicity, specifically in the case of MLE. Now, the listeners that we recruited were asked to rate both the answers and the speakers themselves, the perceived qualities of the speakers, as well as the answers. And we used these evaluation scales where 1 is low, 10 is high. We're interested in the quality of the answer overall, how much expert knowledge was shown by that answer. Would the candidate succeed as a lawyer, in the opinion of the listener? Would that person like to work with the candidate? And then a kind of overall rating score. And I'm going to show you first some data that we collected by way of kind of grounding this, giving this a context relative to other surveys that had been done. So actually what we did initially was just ask people, respondents, around 1,000 of those, to give their subjective responses to just the names for accents. We didn't get them to listen to anything at this point. We just got them to look at a list of accents and say how they perceive those in terms of their prestige and also their pleasantness, their attractiveness to listen to. So what we're looking at here, okay, we've got the accent rating from low to high on the vertical axis, and then different accents of English represented there. This is actually a subset of the accents that were tested. We've got 3 different surveys here. We've got one from the late 1960s. We've got another one from the 2000s, and then our most recent data from just a few months ago, shown in blue. And what you can see there is that we've got RP over there on the left, ranked highest for prestige and pleasantness. Birmingham on the far right, as usual, comes out bottom of the pile, and then various other accents listed in between. What you'll see there is that the blue line for our 2019 data, the curve is, or the slope is actually flatter, which means that there isn't as big a difference between the most highly rated accent RP and the lowest rated one. So there's, they're more balanced in terms of people's perceptions of them. But overall, the slope is the same. Okay, so not much has changed in the last half century, it would seem. I'll now move on to talk about the results that came out of getting our participants actually to listen to the samples. Okay, so once again, we've got the mean evaluation there on the vertical axis, and then our 5 different accents from the ABB project listed at the bottom. You can see that RP comes out overall the top, top rated accent there. Now I should say this, the listeners here were non-lawyers. These were people who didn't have a background in law, and there was about 800 of them, okay? They grouped the two the 2 Northern English accents, so General Northern and Urban West Yorkshire, in more or less the same way. They weren't rated as high as RP, but they were considered about the same as each other. This is when we'd collapsed those various criteria together. We found that they were so highly correlated that it wasn't worth treating them as separate criteria. So we rolled them all into one score that we're calling hireability, okay? So the 2 Northern English accents treated about the same. And then the 2 non-standard Southern accents, Estuary English, Multicultural London English, again, more or less on a par with each other, but rated the lowest. Now, I should say, if you look at the numbers on the y-axis, the vertical scale there, you see that the range of scores is actually really small. So there isn't much in it here. It seems that those quite stark differences that we saw in the previous chart, the one where we asked people to label to rate the labels, there's actually a much narrower difference between the accents in question. And then finally, these are the results for the lawyers. So these are people with expertise in law, with legal training, experience, many of them, of actually doing job interviews for candidates. And what we can see here is that the good quality answers, the very good ones that we scripted, are rated higher than the less good ones, which are shown in green there. But what you'll notice is that the chart is quite flat. There's actually very little difference across the 5 accents there. And finally, if we look at those 2 boxes on the left, you can see that RP overall performs the least well here. It's rated lowest by our expert listeners, which is kind of interesting. That flew in the face to some extent of what we had expected to see. So it looks like here, with these expert listeners, they're to some extent suppressing the accent bias that we might have expected them to show, and which, you know, other data would certainly suggest is out there in the world. They're focusing more on the expertise, so the content of those answers rather than the form. But this effect for RP is kind of interesting because it's as though they're setting the bar a bit higher for RP speakers. They expect better of them than they do for the speakers of the non-standard varieties. It just shows you that attitudes are quite a complex thing, and they're not always positive in the way that you would expect. The last thing I want to mention is the testing of some interventions that we made use of. We ran a set of additional experiments where we tested some interventions to try and see which would be the most effective in terms of asking people to apply a bit of cognitive control over their subjective responses to these accents and samples. We started off with in the understanding that stereotypical reactions to accents are perfectly normal. Everybody has them. You know, their bias is quite a normal feature of human life. It's trying to break the link between bias and actual discrimination, you know, enacting that kind of set of preferences. So we tested 5 different strategies here, as you can see: raising awareness, identifying irrelevant information, committing to fairness and objectivity, increasing accountability, and appealing to multiculturalism. And of the 5, it was the first of those, raising awareness, that seemed to give the most bang for the buck. If you want to know more about this, go onto the ABB website. You can read about this in a lot more detail. So just to wrap up then, it seems that, you know, taking this long view over the last half century, we can see that accent bias does seem to have quite a persistent presence in life in the UK. The hierarchy hasn't changed, you know, with this preference for RP and then the non-standard ones at the far end of the scale. We're seeing, if you look at some of the materials we've provided in the additional materials, the lead-in, the extension materials, you'll see that there seems to be a kind of an age effect whereby younger people seem to have more positive attitudes towards non-standard English. But in the context of that long view that we're taking, the 50-year time span, it seems that we're kind of stuck in this cycle whereby younger people's attitudes tend to become more conservative as they grow older, less tolerant, so to speak. There's also a sensitivity to context at play here. And when you get people actually to listen to speech, actual people talking, rather than just saying, what do you think about Cockney? What do you think about the Queen's English? That kind of thing. You get much more equivalence, much more nuanced answers really than when you get them just to look at labels on a page. And finally, clearly accent bias is still with us. There's still great potential for that to lead to discrimination. But what's encouraging is that the lawyers that we tested showed that where it really counts, people can actually suppress those biases and put them to one side. Nonetheless, we think that making effective interventions, sharing that with the community in human resources departments, in law firms, is absolutely critical. And that's me. Thanks.
There's a question that's come in about perceptions of estuary English, so that EE code in your set. In one of the A-level textbooks, it's described that this is speakers aiming for a classless profile to avoid the unfriendly connotations of RP. And this teacher, I haven't got your name, sorry, had used an example in class about with George Osborne picking up estuary English and using it. So your research shows that estuary English isn't that actually that well regarded. How would you, are perceptions of estuary English perhaps in decline?
I think you have to consider the context in which the estuary English samples are being heard. There are, as we know, these associations between certain sorts of English and elite professions like law and high finance and medicine and so on. So in that context, you know, you could argue that the bar is being set very high, and anybody who's got anything non-standard about their speech might be considered, less than optimal, shall we say. On the other hand, under certain circumstances, having what sounds like an estuary English pronunciation may well be seen as a good thing, and that could lie behind the adoption of estuary sounding features by people like George Osborne. The extent to which that's a conscious decision on his part, we don't know, but it lends, the argument goes, because it sits between RP at one end and then a kind of working class Thames estuary Cockney-like variety at the other. It sits somewhere in the middle, so it's considered more approachable, more warmer, more friendly, a little bit more less intimidating, those sorts of qualities. So very, very heavily dependent on context.